Hello, everyone. My name is Colleen Vincent, and I'm the VP of Community for the James Beard Foundation. Today's webinar is on COVID-19 and supply chains. Just some housekeeping rules for everyone. Please put your questions in the chat function, and we'll try to get to them at the end of our discussion. You can view previous webinars under the Industry Support tab at jamesbeard.org. And at the end of this webinar, about an hour later, there'll be a recording available. So you'll be able to view it again. So understanding supply chains can be daunting even the best of times, and even more so during a pandemic. So for this webinar, we are pleased to welcome Andrew Greene, Adrian Lipscombe, and A-dae Romero-Briones, who will use their experience in support services and work with farmers and chefs to shed some light on how COVID-19 has impacted how our food gets from the field to the kitchen. So I'd like to introduce today's illustrious panelists. First of all, thank you all for your time and energy and expertise around all of this. So first, I'd like to introduce A-dae Briones Romero, who I had the pleasure of meeting actually last fall at the Food Sovereignty Summit hosted by the First Nations Development Institute. She was born and raised in Cochiti, Pueblo, New Mexico. And she also has roots in the Ware family from Hog Creek, Oklahoma. She is Director of Programs for Native Food and Agricultural Programs for the First Nations Development Institute, and is also a Fulbright Scholar, a White House Champion of Change in Agriculture as recognized by President Obama, and the founder and board member of several initiatives and institutes, such as the Aspen Institute's Rural Development Initiative. She was also previously Director of Community Development for Pulama Lanai, co-founder and executive director for a nonprofit for Cochiti Pueblo, and worked for the University of Arkansas's Indigenous Food and Agricultural Initiative. So thank you, A-dae. Our next speaker happens to be a close personal friend of mine. Chef Adrian Lipscombe is a native Texan and owner of the Uptown Cafe and Bakery and Urbanlocity, an urban planning firm. Uptown Cafe, which is located in La Crosse, Wisconsin, is a hearth for the community and also a community impact space. Her food focuses on Southern cuisines by using local ingredients and working with farmers in the Coulee Regional and Organic Valley area. She draws her inspiration and storytelling from experiences from her own life and, of course, African-American culinary history to tell the story of that influence on our food culture today. She also holds a master's in architecture and is currently a PhD candidate in urban and regional planning at the University of Texas at Austin, concentrating on the behavior of minorities to land use and transportation. She also has another initiative, which when I turn the floor over to our panelists, she'll be discussing with you. Our next panelist is Andrew Greene, who is based in Long Island. He is a sector purchasing manager and central support team at the Compass Group. He also works with the Chartwell High School. Sorry, I had this right. He also works with Chartwell, which he will talk more about when I turn the floor over to him as well. He works to reduce waste and improve satisfaction and profitability, oversees the purchases of products and services, and connects the dots between suppliers, farmers, and stakeholders in a network of 300 college campuses across the United States. He has also worked as an executive chef at several prestigious universities. Now, I'm going to turn the floor over to A-dae to talk a little bit more about what she is doing, particularly now. So A-dae, the floor is yours.
Gwetsi Hopa, it's such an honor to be here with you all and to be with my esteemed panelists. I'm from Cochiti, Pueblo, New Mexico. And what does First Nations do? So First Nations is a granting intermediary, and I think I have the best job in the world in that I get to fund and work with Indigenous communities across the US mainland, Alaska, and Hawaii. Most of our projects that we fund are focused on traditional food systems, but of course in Indian country there's 73 tribes in the United States. So there's an array of different food systems that we get to work with, all the way from the traditional food side, all the way to agribusiness communities that are looking to develop economic development through food and everything in between. And so we at First Nations, we really try to allocate resources to places of most need. So that means that we have to constantly be monitoring the state of food systems in Indian country. So it's pretty exciting. And again, thank you for having me.
Thank you, A-dae. Adrian?
All right. It wouldn't let me off mute. Hi, I'm Adrian Lipscombe. I'm here in La Crosse, Wisconsin. I own a restaurant and we are active, but we are curbside and delivery. We have not opened at all during the entire pandemic, even through shelter in place. We decided to stay closed. Right now, we are working on a couple initiatives. One is feeding our community. Two, we're working with the city to look at our victory gardens and to see how we can implement them in everyday use. People like to plant things, but they don't know what to do with it after they plant things and grow things. So that's one initiative that we're working on. Another one I started is called 40 Acre Project, in which we will be looking to preserve the legacy of Black foodways and also Black farmers and Black farmers in education, to the point that we're working with different organizations to secure land for Black farmers. These initiatives are really close to my heart, and around the same time, we are working with farmers to look at what they're growing now and what does that look like for the future of restaurants.
Thank you, Adrian. Andrew?
Yes, thank you. Firstly, I'd like to applaud the James Beard Foundation for what you've been doing and the resources being shared and the conversations being had during the pandemic, plus the industry-leading shifts to both empower the previously disenfranchised minority and women-owned businesses and just industry professionals. It's inspiring, and what an honor it is to join this group of rock star panelists today. Right now, my organization is focusing on opening up as safely and as soundly as possible for our associates and our students at the over 300 college campuses nationwide that we have the privilege to serve. Daily, I help great people buy great products and services from great companies. And I too believe I have the greatest job in the world. We get to nourish college students' minds, the students and the faculty and the staff that help them learn. And I do this by breaking down barriers for excellence downstream and developing and communicating a set of tools and best practices. We learn from our challenges. Not everything goes as planned. And we also take advantage of opportunities. And during COVID, my organization, we were able to help manufacturers donate over 120,000 pounds of food to food banks and nonprofits from coast to coast and even up to the University of Alaska and Interior Alaska. So again, excited to be a part of the conversation and share what I know and learn more today.
Wow, thank you very much, Andrew. So, my first question will be, just to kind of frame, where we go with this, is what are the kind of supply chain challenges you're seeing from your particular perspectives? So, Adrian, I'll start with you on that particular question, then A-dae, and then Andrew.
I think it's quite interesting. Like I said, I'm located in La Crosse, Wisconsin, so I'm 2 hours away from Minneapolis and about 2.5 hours or so away from Madison. So I'm stuck kind of in the middle of a valley. When we started really examining as a restaurateur how this was going to affect, or the food chain was going to affect us during COVID, even with meat supply and such, we kind of thought more 5 to 6 steps ahead. So we've reached out to our farmers ahead of time to see where their supply was and what were they going to have available and how was it going to affect our menu, if we were going to have to pull things off the menu ahead of time or just set and be prepared to take an influx or switch things around. For that, that made it easier for us us to think about the future versus thinking about right now, because of the products that were coming in. During this time, we were still in this phase of things were planted and were growing. So we weren't necessarily too concerned as much as we were for protein, due to what was happening. A lot of the issues that I was seeing, even in contact, looking through our social media and our farmers in Wisconsin, was more of it being processed, because a lot of people were there wasn't a lot of dates for proteins to be processed at the butcher. So that was a lot of our hiccup right there. But through working with our farmers, we were able to secure what we needed along the way. When I talked to my other restaurateurs that may have gone and used like Reinhardt or Cisco or other corporation offices, they had an influx of things that were hitting their expiration date, and it was coming really close to hitting some of these dates. Right now we have in La Crosse, we do have a Reinhardt center here, and so we saw that influx of restaurants that were not taking products that they shipped to Madison or the larger cities. Their units went down, where they were having 300 units for a delivery. They were going down to like 46 units to a delivery, down to a city. So we knew there was an abundancy amount of food that was going to go bad here in La Crosse. And so we really pushed with working with them to get it to our hunger task force, or to send it out to where it was really well needed, because there were restaurants that were just completely shut.
Wow. A-dae?
Yeah. Well, I work with Indian Country, and our primary goal has been to fund community-based food projects. But with the onslaught of COVID, we found ourselves in a very unique position in that we had to become a direct service provider. We normally don't figure out food logistics. We normally don't get food to communities. We fund those things, but because of COVID, there was such a disruption in current supply chains. We had to we stepped in and helped where we could, and I think everybody in Indian Country found themselves in that position. And we're talking about communities that are already outside of the food supply chain. And so when COVID hit, those weaknesses of that supply chain were exacerbated. So we're talking about communities that are dependent on what I call long distance supply chains, in that they would normally have to get in a car and go at least on average an hour to the nearest store to get food and bring it back home. And because of like town closures, because of social distancing, by the time a lot of these people would get to their normal grocery store, food supply would be out. And so we hear Adrian, who has there's this influx of food in certain places, and then in my communities where you have no food. And so we've had to certainly adjust how we operate daily. Many communities are still without water right now, still without food. We're still trying to work through it. And it seems like the rest of the country is sort of moving on and trying to figure these out. Indian Country is still struggling, certainly. And we see that every day. We've adjusted our activities and our function. We are trying to build up distribution points. I mean, it's basically creating a makeshift supply chain currently, while trying to figure out how to create long-term solutions to meet these. And I hope to talk more about that as we get further in the discussion.
We will. Andrew, what are you seeing?
Yeah, wow. Well, certainly a lot of similar things that Adrian and A-dae mentioned. And to add on that, personnel furloughs, right? So we might have extra supply here and not enough supply there. And then to help connect those dots, we're also communicating with folks that might be out of work, unfortunately, due to general business reductions, right? Workforce reduction. So just furloughs of folks. And obviously there's a heartfelt piece to that, but then also, trying to communicate and find out who else to communicate with to help solve those challenges has certainly been unique. Lead time. I think we all could pretty much relate to the fact, right, that Amazon's no longer really next day, and local deliveries are, you gotta get in your car and do the curbside. I think as A-dae mentioned, right, there's a little bit more effort from the end user to connect to their supply chain because lead times are just longer. And if you're ordering anything, whether it's in bulk or in one-offs, you're seeing extended lead times. We have many manufacturers that are saying minimum 3 weeks, and in reality 5-6 weeks for lead time. Wow. And I think everyone's looking for the same thing, right? Ultimately, in many categories like PPE and individually wrapped utensils and cutlery and disposables, multiple industry segments are converting to single use now, which is certainly going to put additional challenges and strain on that supply chain.
And also the environment to some degree, right?
For sure.
And then Andrew, you work very specifically with like colleges and universities, and there have been a number of stories prior to COVID-19 about hunger at college campuses. Have there been any discussions about that you've been participated in regard to like the current situation?
Yeah, so Chartwell's Higher Ed has the good fortune to work with campuses from coast to coast and up to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And depending on which campus, we have very robust, unique programs to help feed folks that are food insecure. I actually like to flip the phrase and call it food security, because the company I work for helps feed folks that are hungry. And our motto is, we are where hungry minds gather. And so depending on which campus and what the realities are on that campus, we help, whether it's student groups on campus or directly working with the campus and officials to identify folks that need certain meal plan adjustments. And certainly off campus too, we help local food banks and shelters, certainly reducing food waste. One thing I like to encourage is keeping a food bank and local nonprofits on speed dial, so that way, to Adrian and A-dae's point, when we have products that could potentially go bad, we're making a phone call preemptively to make sure that we're feeding hungry folks and not wasting food.
Thank you. So that brings me to my next question, because Andrew was talking about work for the food insecure on college campuses, and that was certainly something that was happening prior to COVID-19. So, A-dae, you first, but what are the pre-COVID issues that contributed to these present challenges? Because, COVID has only been here, in full force for 3 months, but it takes a lot more time than that for a system to, break down. So what were some of the pre-COVID issues as you see them that contributed to what's happening right now?
Well, I think we all have our understanding of like how our food system works, whether as consumers or people who work in food systems, who are chefs or business owners. Like, we think we understand what our food system is like. We go to the store and we buy food. But what COVID is really telling us is there's entire populations, entire communities that are outside of these supply chains that are not even an afterthought. Like, we're just so far outside of these supply chains. And some folks have done work on food deserts, food apartheid, if you will, but even that, I think, is a weak description of the centralization of our food system. And when you centralize the food system in the way that we see it being centralized, that means that the further away from these central places you are, the least apt you are to get these food sources. And so all along, the Native agriculture and food systems at First Nations has been focusing on building community-based food systems, but we're finding more so now than ever is that there are regulations and there are infrastructure needs that inhibit locally based community production and distribution of these foods. We're talking about like individually wrapping utensils. We're talking about how farmers harvest the food and then they have to process that food in order to prevent foodborne illness. All these things require infrastructure, and despite the fact that you can grow food further away from these centralized distribution points, it still means you need infrastructure to participate in a food system and get these food out to community members. And those things require not only financial investment, they take social investment, and they take even cultural investment. And all of these things are extremely fragile in many of the communities in the United States that are just afterthoughts right now. And so all those things contribute to the fragility of these communities who are currently like struggling to find food.
Thank you. And but I'm going to ask Adrian the same question, and then I want to go back to you, A-dae, because something you mentioned reminds me of some discussions that happened at the Food Sovereignty Summit. So I'm going to follow up on that. But Adrian, what are some of the pre-COVID issues that you see that contribute to the present challenges? And the reason I ask you very specifically is because you work as a chef, but you also worked as a city planner, and also so as a chef, you have intimate relationships with farmers themselves, but you also understand like distribution chains just from, helping essentially plot out how cities run, how things go through towns. So what is from your perspective, like what kinds of issues have contributed to the present challenges that you've seen?
So, I'm going to talk from a smaller city, and then I'll go to a larger city perspective and looking at what's happening. Being here, it is a blue collar city that I'm in. So we have a lot of low income population or demographics that is here in this city. But one of the things that we noticed right away moving in here is that there's not a lot of farm to tables. We are surrounded by a lot of organic farms, but a lot of our food was not hitting our restaurants. Secondly, there's probably about 2 or 3 of us that uses some products from farmers. So that's a serious issue that we see here that developed before pre-COVID. I think it was there's a huge gap in connection between that restaurant world in farming and agriculture here that needs to be filled, or that sector of which it can cross-pollinate against each other to bring products to restaurants. That was something that we were definitely working on here in that supply chain, and where do you go? Because when COVID hit as a smaller city and restaurants shut down, we still had large distributions that had an abundancy of food, and we didn't know what to do with that. But then also you had the farmers that were starting to get large abundancies of food, and they didn't know what to do with it either. So there was this issue that we were coming up or butting up against on pricing, and how were they deciding to price things and materials, and who were you going to get it from? That became a serious issue here. And then also the lack of certain things that we couldn't find. So like the utensils and such, and the to-go containers, because it's like putting a plate together every single time, and you're giving a plate away every single time. So, being able to find those supplies on demand, it became an issue. Flour became a larger issue too, and the grains, because everybody got into sourdough. So then when you're looking at the grocery store chain supply, you couldn't find flour. But if you went to the restaurant chain supply, they had abundancy of flour, and because the restaurants were closed. And so how do you distribute those, distribute flour, we started making like 5-pound bags, and how do we sell that? So you start seeing restaurants becoming more grocery stores, because they had access to be able to buy almost in bulk these supplies because our flour came in 50-pound bags, which, we went to the grocery store and you could buy only one bag of flour or two types of bags of flours at a time. It was also, I became very well connected at our grocery store and in their produce department and kind of figuring out, what are they getting? What are they missing? What can we supply and help the community with too? So it was a lot of communication issues. And then what we started to see is how we need to communicate more, just not with our distributors, but also with our grocery stores that are around that do carry these organics from these farmers, or ask them to carry other organics from farmers that were getting it. So, it ended up being more of a larger conversation. City-wise, the larger city-wise is what we were starting to investigate and seeing was, there was access to food, but there was not enough food. So you would have like the Hunger Task Force, or where you could go the pantries to pick up food. If you take Austin, for example, or San Antonio, they were showing up by drones of thousands to get food, and there wasn't enough food. Another thing that we started to see is that people don't cook. There's people don't cook, so sometimes they were getting things they weren't use or didn't know how to use. So the concept of starting to make pre-made meals, and so you start seeing a lot of organizations starting to make warm pre-made meals to give out, because we were steadily surprised how many people were still ordering from us food at the time, and not with any change of price or such, but we started getting more orders in because people were not cooking. So you have like a whole part of our society that are not making, they're not using their stove, they may be boiling water, but they're not cooking food. So what does that really look like and work when you receive a bag of food and you don't know what to do with it? A lot of people still prefer to order out. So there's this whole dynamic, because now you have children at home instead of at school. So you have to have three separate meals, hopefully, for the kid, where they got 2 meals at school. So that was a whole issue that came up to go, can the schools who still had food in their refrigerators at the time of shutdown, how do we work with them to get this food to the kids? And so you started having different like hot zones of different schools that were still making food and making food available for kids to have them come pick up, so they at least had those 2 meals a day. So I think as a chef, I ended up becoming more connected with our grocery store chain, and also working with our education and elementary school, and also our pantry, to kind of understand that flow, and making sure this information was able to be distributed across the community, so they had different options to where they were able to get food.
Thank you, Adrian. And Andrew, what are the pre-COVID issues that you have seen that have contributed to the present challenge?
Yeah, so fascinating answers so far, and I agree. I think quite frankly, and before I specifically get to your question, quite frankly, I was invited to a Organic Valley conference call a few weeks ago in Georgetown. Professors were there speaking, brilliant minds in supply chain, and they said when they went to school for supply chain management 20 years ago, no one knew what supply chain management was, right? And I just went to school only a few years ago for supply chain management after getting a culinary degree, and even explaining then, no one knew what supply chain management was, right? So I'm talking 24, 36 months ago, people didn't know. And, you went into the grocery store to buy food, or you went to a restaurant to buy a meal. You didn't quite know, you didn't quite understand, you didn't really care where the food came from, really. Just the fact that you could buy bananas, the fact that you could buy the groceries you needed, that understanding was what was important. So that pre-COVID kind of laissez-faire, go to the grocery store, go to a restaurant, overnight, right? There was this newfound relationship with food and community and supply chain that was beautiful in a weird sense for me to witness. And the chefs reconnected with restaurants, local farmers, and certainly better understanding what's in the grocery store. To me, that has been an interesting opportunity to witness, to unfold. And frankly, getting back to your specific question, logistics and supply chain pre-COVID, we didn't have enough drivers then. Folks weren't necessarily growing up and saying, I want to be a truck driver to deliver from X to Y to Z. I want to go from coast to coast. I want to operate trains and deliver goods and services, right? So pre-COVID, there was already this supply chain shortage of personnel to help deliver. I think, tariffs and political challenges pre-COVID certainly helped contribute to COVID response. I think we're still seeing those political kind of conversations unfold today, and globalization, right? No doubt pre-COVID, the world shrunk in terms of, Shark Tank saying, hey, if you can get something cheaper overseas and save 3 cents a unit, I'll invest in you. So specifically saying, go overseas and I'll, outsource and I'll invest in your company. I think as a general kind of sense, that was a challenge pre-COVID that might have been impacted during COVID, and we might see some of that change moving forward. More local, more hyper-local, and turn it into an opportunity, right? Certainly capitalism's still there. I'm not saying that, profits are going away and we need to, give everything away, but where we can identify cost savings and still diversify and invest locally, I think that's going to be certainly one of the learning curves coming out of this for sure.
So, so now we're in this age of COVID where people are learning more about how systems work than ever. And so some of the things, the challenges we have addressed here are, imbalance of, resources, not enough personnel, certainly between the drivers and then the essential workers at the processing plants. It's become almost untenable in some places. And certainly the fact that, people are very used to eating all kinds of things at all kinds of times throughout this country, makes that farm to table movement that, a lot of chefs champion, something that should be less of a fashion and certainly more of just the way things are. And A-dae, I wanted to, follow up when we were talking about the pre-COVID issues. When I went to the Food Sovereignty Summit, there were multiple discussions about amending tribal codes specifically for food sales and food productions. Of course, all of this happened like pre-COVID. Is there space? Because I remember that, the initial paper was what, 1,500 pages or some insanity, and each nation and each region was adapting it for the local communities. But has there been room for response to these changes within some of those tribal codes? Have any nations started to address some of these challenges that we've been discussing as it stands right now?
Yes, I would say yes, absolutely. There's a lot of tribes who are working on establishing their own tribal codes. Right now, never in my life did I call meat protein until after COVID, and we're working on logistical issues. Like that's the term of logistics. Like you're either working on produce or protein. And so what we're seeing is a lot of tribes are focusing on creating these codes that are focused on like the meat supply chain, which is wonderful. But this hits on like one important issue, is that like so much of our American food system, like you said, is like we can have anything at any time. We can go to any restaurant. We can choose Chinese, Italian, West African, Caribbean, whatever is our fancy at the time, we can find someplace, right? That's the American way. And that speaks to this like nationalization of our food system. But what we're seeing is that, like I think I've heard it from all the panelists, is that like local food systems are most able to pivot and adjust to the needs of the community like right now. But we're in a system that is hyper focused and hyper regulated to support a national food system. And so when you think about indigenous communities, like we've been growing food for a millennia, but why don't we do it now? Why are we not growing enough food to feed our communities right now post or during the COVID event. And part of it is lessons in nationalization of our food system. When you have national policies that dictate who are the suppliers, how do you transport food, how do you process that food, how do you sell that food. This like nationalization has happened to American Indian communities long before COVID happened. And what the result is that you have disrupted, localized food, not only production, but behaviors. Like your whole diet changes according to what food is available. And if you have a national food policy or national regulations that determine what those things are, your whole behavior change, your whole community changes. And so what with the tribal codes, we're trying to encourage the codification of those localized behaviors again. We're trying to protect those speaking to the land and working with the land and eating what comes from your land, because ultimately that's like how you show you love your community or you love your place. You cook the food that is grown from your neighbor next door. You buy the tomatoes from the farmer's market that the grandma grew over the summer. You know, those are the things those are the behaviors that show how you love a place. And the tribal codes are a way to codify those things so that we can return to those things.
Thank you. And I will have a follow-up to that. But Adrian, I've seen that, you talked about, working with the grocery stores, and I know a lot of chefs have kind of switched to feeding communities, but are there specific adaptations for your business model that you have made in response? Because obviously, yes, it is wonderful for us to be, to feed our communities. Everybody deserves healthy, nutritious food and food access, period, no matter what kind of financial situation they are in. However, you are a food entrepreneur, and this is the business that you work in, and there's certainly room for that as well. So what are the adaptations that you've made in specific response to this, this crisis? And I want to add on top of that, and I will ask A-dae and Andrew some of the similar questions in terms of like safety concerns. We've already talked about single-use packaging and the challenges involved in that, and wanting to be a good member of your community, but also the fact of the matter is single-use things contribute to degradation of the community in the long term. So what kind of adaptations are you or will you be making in response to what's happening right now?
Yeah, I mean, I count myself lucky, but I'm in a unique space that our restaurant isn't really big. So we were able to pivot pretty quickly and kind of understand what we needed to do. But it was also not just paying attention to what was happening in our city, but it was also looking at the larger cities and how they were adapting and changing to the rapidness of the shelter in place, because we did not shelter in place till a little bit later. So definitely was paying attention to what was happening. Some of the things that we decided to do and change right away was to take things off our menu that was not going to work with to go. It just was not going to be pretty in a box to go. It wasn't going to travel nicely to go. Those were some of the things that we automatically pulled. We wanted to also make sure that we were using sustainable materials that we were sending out, because we are sending out materials every day, more waste every day. So all these restaurants are sending out waste every day. And how do we make sure that our material, that what we are putting out was going to be sustainable and that it was going to be biodegradable? So that was something that was just, we were adamant that was going to be part of our mission that we needed to do. Also, and to our food wise, is we started to pivoting to more of take and bake. We thought putting a little education into cooking your own food, we may get you to a point, but you can finish it too. So a lot of our baked goods, we worked on recipes, like we went straight into changing recipes to see how they were going to freeze and see if people could order them in bigger packages, because now they're no longer just going to eat with a friend and want to eat a scone. Now they're going to be at home with their kids and they're still going to want a scone, but how are they, how they have to share. So, we started bulking up certain things of doing a dozen or a half dozen in order for people to be able to take home and eat now or eat later. So that became really big. Things where we started getting messages, oh, we crave this sauce or this dressing because we made them all in house. So they could no longer have it on demand without ordering, but they were craving it at 12 o'clock at night, or they should have got food earlier that day. So we had to start bottling up our food. So we ended up turning a little bit into a grocerant, like a grocery store restaurant. We were like, starting to make, our lemon curd on, people wanted to buy our lemon curd, our caramel sauce, our chocolate sauce, things that we have, they were starting to crave or wanting to add to some things that they were making. So we ended up jarring some of our products that people would be able to come and pick them up. We make our own pickles when they come in season. So we're working on what were expectations of what's coming in the season and what we're going to be able to adapt, because we feel like we'll be in the situation for a period, a little bit longer. We're in Wisconsin. Our numbers have gone dramatically up. So we feel that at this point that we know we may have permission to open our doors, but for the safety of my own family, my community, and my staff, I cannot do that. So at this point, we have to figure out, what does fast casual restaurants look like now? And what will they look like in the future? And is that grocerant option, could it fit us? Could it fit that opportunity that you can order things to go? Another thing is the delivery service, working with the Eat Streets, the Uber Eats, the Grubhub. We have to we started developing relationships. Even though we started looking at the percentages of what they're charging, we were like, can we deliver ourselves? Like, what does this look like? What is this responsibility do we hold? Is there loyalty programs? I mean, we've been through it all. Like, we have people who are very loyal. We are community based. We are community impact based. People came to us because we were a community. They knew it was a safe space. But how are we adjusting this? How are we changing this? Also working on the city planning level, so thinking larger. When we were allowed to open again and shelter in place was taken away, we knew that we weren't opening, so we needed curbside permitting. So how did I get them? In one day I called and said, I need a sign for curbside permanent curbside so people can pick it up. And they were like, we just did this through the downtown. We'll get a sign to you in a couple days. Like, going ahead and start calling and talking to your planning department to figure out what's next, what's new. We don't have seating outside, but can you adjust to have seating? I mean, outside, we can't do seating inside, but can we have a seating outside? What does that look like? We work with our health department to figure out how seating could be adjusted outside. We're working hard to talk about, can we close off streets and have those adaptations where, if there are a lot of restaurants, can they have dinner in the street and, with social distancing in that fact. Where we're located at, we're one of the only restaurants. We're not downtown, we're on the north side. But how do we work in such a way that we're still giving them that we're still part of the community, and they're still able to give that impact within the community? So it's working with other businesses in that area too, and making sure that we are working together as one to make sure we keep our area revitalized and we can keep going without losing more businesses off in our area.
Wow, and so you're talking in a very local space, and I want to move to Andrew, who's talking in a more nationwide space. Like, what adaptations you've seen in response, particularly around safety concerns is a big one. And somebody also asked, back to the single use, like, is there an effort to make sure that these single use items are environmentally friendly, and like, what is the process around that? So if you could just share a little bit of some of those adaptations, we'd greatly appreciate that.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I think at the heart of our adaptations, we double down on the menus of change principles, which are stopping food waste and being more sustainable. And I heard Chef mention it before, and A-dae mentioned it, more meatless proteins, right? So those are more sustainable solutions to incorporate into your menus, especially when some of the meat supply chain has issues in terms of producing. So timing of forecasting there is critical in terms of safety for single use and compostables and disposables. You know, the most important piece there for any operator is getting their needs locked and loaded, understanding what they need to serve in terms of type of vessel and how they're going to pivot and adapt their menus, and then what they're going to put into it. But when you're predicting and you're forecasting as best as you can, that's great. But you also need to communicate that to someone who's going to help deliver. So wherever your disposables are coming from, we have great relationships and conversations to after we identify what we're going to be serving the vessels, then forecasting how many of those vessels and trying to earmark that supply for our operators from coast to coast. And certainly if you run out of disposables to put the food in, right? Even if the food's available, meat, protein, or animal protein, or meatless, then you still need that vessel to serve in. So getting the forecast, my advice would be done ahead of time, understanding what your needs are in terms of composting on site or not composting and just needing single-use disposables, and then understanding quantity, so that way ultimately you're not increasing your food waste because you ran out of disposables to serve. You know, ultimately, if you have food in the shelf in the walk-in to serve, and you don't have something to put it in where your consumers can either Uber Eats or curbside pickup, right, and safely consume it, then that's a balance that might be a little out of whack, and you ultimately might be wasting food because you don't have the vessel. So for our organization, we double down on reducing waste and meatless proteins almost as a redundancy, adding more of that into the menu, into the system, and then understanding our needs and communicating them and getting supply chain earmarked for us, so that way we can reduce shortages and ultimately reduce waste of the food that we bring in to put into those containers. But it's certainly not an easy solution. It's a great question, a tough question, but my advice would be get ahead of it and ask for help and lean into your network to get the answers that you need.
Thank you, Andrew. And this question will be, you know, obviously for everyone, and it will be a big question. It's like, what kind of long-term changes will need to be implemented to create a stronger future for restaurant and consumer supply chains? And this is very much that's the jackpot question, right? Because here you have a chef and city planner working very much in her community to address what the future looks like for her business as it pertains to the community. Then you have, A-dae is basically helping people create a whole local supply chain, which, and I'm going to, the long-term change I'm going to ask you about first, A-dae, because, I would imagine these very targeted responses that's happening, particularly with you and Adrian, are things that might become models for the broader national community, certainly, Andrew, about, you're talking about questions of taste, availability, profitability, and then just in general, like how, it's just like how. And so those questions kind of start being addressed in a grassroots level first. So A-dae, if you would make some recommendations, because you're talking about communities that are outside of the general food system, that are essentially recreating food systems. So that means everything from distribution to disposal to possibly even manufacturing, certainly agriculture. What kinds of long-term structural changes do you think will get us to where we need to be after this is, if not over, certainly, part of our everyday existence.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two very important thoughts that need to be said here. Is one, yes, Indian country is outside of the supply chain. We're at the end of every supply chain, and so people rarely get a glimpse into what's happening in tribal communities, but the same can be said for many disenfranchised communities within cities. But why is this important to the rest of the country? Because it exposes some of the weaknesses in our current supply chains. So the more you know about these communities, the more you know about the weaknesses of the entire supply chain. So I think first and foremost, people need to understand why these issues are happening and who they're happening to, because that will give us some insight into how we need to move forward and even determine like what we don't need. There's probably parts of this whole process and this whole supply chain that we just need to get rid of. And so we're in a unique opportunity in this country where we can decide that, like we can actually have those conversations, which is so incredibly important. And then the second thing is that we really should be focusing on the people who are outside of these supply chains, because they probably have skills that they have developed in response to being outside of these supply chains. So you have people or communities that are still cooking largely, right? I don't know if you can say that for a lot of cities. You still have people who understand how to like process meat on their own without having to go to the store to buy it. And those are very valuable skills in the time when our supply chains fail us. And so seeking out these communities are and advice from these communities, or even having them be teachers to how we adjust to supply chain failure is really, really important. Maybe it's like zombie apocalypse training, or maybe it's just like post-COVID training. We don't know, but those skills always become valuable. And I think just to be said, that's where most of our culinary history and roots come from these communities that began that way. And so it only makes sense for us to return to those folks who are still living in that sort of food supply network, to remind us of how resilient we are as communities and as people, and even as a nation.
Thank you, A-dae. And Adrian, very specifically, what can chefs do to ensure a stronger future for our supply chains?
I think even listening to what everybody's saying, I'm finding myself and even recognizing that I've been going so much as local as possible within my area to help to impact a little bit of that sustainability factor. And I think that's one thing as a chef that we really need to recognize is what's grown in your area, what's in season in your area, what can you use in that area, even down to the farmers, even down to the ranchers, down to the butchers, and having these conversations and making those connections. Like I said, it wasn't difficult for us to flip and pivot because we had these connections within our community that we could work with, that we weren't struggling at the point where we were trying to find certain things. We were able to pivot and change, but also be flexible into changing your menu and to adapting new things that are grown in your area, or that's going to be in a higher supply in your area, and not trying to go as far as to, if you're inland and you're trying to get fish, come on now, not during COVID. You know, there's issues that we really need to step back and take a look at, and really celebrate the land in which you are on and which you are around, versus, you know, trying to get something from overseas, you know, to be on your plate. You know, how important is that? So that, I think that's another thing to look at, is like, how important is that material or that ingredient on your plate, and what does it really mean, and how did it get there? Like how long did it travel to get to you? And most of the times, a lot of my products were picked the night before and they were brought to our restaurant. You know, meeting the farmer, talking to the farmer, communicating with the farmer, going to our grocer, communicating with them, letting them meet our farmers, like making those smaller connections to make it more hyper local in our area. made us stronger. And it's something that we, are hoping to carry on, and hopefully other restaurants are looking too, and talk to other restaurants. We end up being in silos so much and competitive so much. We are in competition so much. We don't talk to other chefs about the opportunity to help a farmer. We may have this product, but the farmer has a lot of it. Introduce them to the other chefs that are around so the product can be used. And so we can make sure our farmers are being sustainable, and that they're still going to be here after COVID.
Thank you, Adrian. And Andrew, for you very specifically, what can distributors do to ensure the long-term health and strength of our supply chain? And are there parts of the supply chain that we need to, remove or augment or expand or contract?
Yeah, no, great question. I think planning, developing, and executing something with redundancies and leveraging technologies and relationships is critical. So plan, develop, and execute, and then reflect. I think we all post-COVID are going to be doing more reflection and enjoying and trying to relive more of a connection both to our family and to our community and to our supply chain. But we each have a vote. We each have a say. Gary Hirschberg from Stonyfield Farm once said, "You vote with your dollar at the grocery store. Every time you're at the grocery store, you're voting, right?" So my advice would be simple: that we ask for help and we vote with confidence. We vote with our dollars, put them in the right place. We do our jobs and be brilliant at the basics. My organization is very fortunate to work with a GPO, or a group purchasing organization, that works with a variety of suppliers, manufacturers, and distributors. And, our response was a little bit easier because we were already cultivating relationships with Foodbuy and our distributor partners. But having a centralized plan, developing that plan, customizing it, and once you execute it, doing a post-mortem and reflecting, I think is going to be important. And lastly, I think we all have distributors, manufacturers, farmers. We all have both a fiduciary, a financial, and a human responsibility to do whatever is possible to reduce food waste and to be more sustainable and keep food banks and local nonprofits on speed dial, so we eliminate product going to the landfill.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew. And I want to thank everyone for your amazing questions. This webinar will actually be available online in about an hour after we close. I want to thank my wonderful friends, A-dae Romero-Briones, Adrian Lipscombe, and Andrew Greene, for sharing some solutions for us as not only consumers, but also as chefs. As my personal opinion, that chefs will become even more important in the COVID-19 world. Again, because Adrian says, a lot of people don't like to cook, but also, the strength of being that tastemaker, that link of an actual human in the supply chain that can make, change taste, change policy, certainly agitate for waste reduction and a more local approach to ingredients. And so I want to thank you all for your creativity, sensitivity, and solutions around, something that most of us never thought we were going to have a broad conversation about, but here we are. So it's an opportunity for everybody to participate in building a better future for all of us. So thank you again. And have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.